Oh, there's another chat. This week we're going to be focusing on continuing the, oh, I see your message, Sean, on with short fiction terminology and extending that to point of view this week. Also, we'll be looking at some specific critical lenses. This past week, you should have been looking at critical lenses in a general sense, like what are critical lenses? I'm going to talk about that a little bit more and take questions if you have them. But this week, we're going to focus on specific critical lenses because the paper I'm going to ask you to write asks you to use them when you're analyzing a new piece of fiction. So we're going to be moving in that direction. If you go to the learning activities and assignments, there are some updates and things I want to talk about before we get into our class material. One of those things is the upcoming hybrid schedule, the switch to the hybrid schedule, and the family survey. You might have seen that I posted in Google Classroom. I tend to use Google Classroom more as an announcement type thing now that we have Blackboard. So that's pretty much how I use Google Classroom. But I posted that there is a survey. I'll repost it again today, but they do need feedback from everybody about whether you would like to come to campus part-time starting on September 28th through, continuing on, or whether you'd rather stay with your distance learning situation. That is your decision, and they kind of want to get a feel for that so they can make sure that they schedule things and organize things in a way that is safe on campus. You can't have too many people on campus at a time. They've figured out that there's a certain number of students that you can have in the classroom with a 6-foot radius. I think it's like 8 people. So they're trying to figure out how all that's going to work for people who do want to come back at least part-time for the hybrid schedule. Nobody's talking about right now going back to a regular schedule with everybody. Right now, it's just assumed that the rest of the year will either you'll be on hybrid where you're coming to school, or you'll be on, distance learning, and that's your choice throughout the year. So they do need feedback from you so they can start preparing. And I put a link here to the survey for you. So if you haven't filled that out, you haven't talked to your parents and had them fill it out, then you should do that so that we can get the most accurate numbers possible. Right now, they're working off of some survey they did in July about how many people would want to be on campus and how many people wouldn't. And that might not be accurate anymore. Now that we've had 3 weeks of distance learning, maybe people's opinions changed on that. The first part of the survey, I was looking at it, the first whole page is describing the security measures that they put in place, the safety measures they put in place, and all that stuff, how that's going to work. So if you go to that survey, it explains that first before they start asking your opinions. Do you want me to talk about hybrid schedule at all? Did I talk about that already?
How
You know
would
what they
it
mean by?
work?
Yeah, let me just talk about it a little bit, and you can pop questions in the chat or interrupt me, unmute yourself if you want. So the hybrid schedule is going to be some kind of version where if you choose that option, you can come to school, I think 2 days a week. And so you'll go through your schedule, you'll work with your teachers in the classroom, socially distancing and all that stuff. And then the other 3 days a week, you'll be asynchronous at home, or you might be synchronous from home. So like it's basically a 2-day on campus a week situation. You can change back if you decide, say you decide to go with hybrid and it's just not working for you or whatever, you can switch out like throughout the year. You can go back to distance learning, not on a daily basis or a weekly basis, I think by 6 weeks. So you can try it out for a while, see how it is, or you can just decide to stay at home for as long as you feel like that's the safe thing to do. So hybrid has it where you would be in the school environment for part-time and then at home part-time. Will the times be extended for us online? I don't know what you mean by times. Do you mean like deadlines and stuff? Or do you mean like class period times, Sean? Class period times? Okay. Yeah, so the class period times, I don't know. I've heard 2 different things. First, they were telling me we would have the same schedule. It's just that some kids would come to school Monday and Tuesday and do their synchronous time in the classroom. And then they would do their asynchronous time at home. Just this morning, one of the administrators was in my first period class and she stuck around afterwards and we were talking and she said that's not what she understood. So I'm not 100% and it's confusing me because I'm trying to prepare in my mind for how do I get ready to teach with that situation. So I was telling her, you only need to think about the teachers trying to pivot and make sure that the kids at home and the kids at school and everybody's getting everything. And she goes, oh, we didn't think about that. Oh, maybe you should. Yeah. So anyway, so I'm thinking that it will be, when you come to school, it will either be synchronous, meaning your teacher's delivering lessons and recording it for the kids that are at home or doing a Zoom, or you would come for asynchronous and get help, right? Like, so that would be an opportunity for you to work one-on-one with your teacher and so on. So it's some version of that. So you can kind of decide if you want to be on campus a couple days a week and have interaction with your teachers and the availability to use the computers and, you know, the library and all that stuff, then you might want to try out hybrid. If you're kind of like, it's not worth it to me, I'm doing okay on this distance stuff, maybe you want to stay with it. I don't know. That's a family decision. But yeah, so they're also trying to decide, because they're extending our thing for 4 more weeks, but every week they have to implement more students on campus. So starting on the 28th, it looks like the teachers are all going to go back to school. So I'll be leaving my glorious studio here in my dining room and moving to my classroom, and they'll be trying to decide which student populations are going to be invited to hybrid first. It's not going to be like on the 28th, everybody who wants to do hybrid is going to show up. It's going to be a phase in because they can't have more than about 300 students on campus at a time. That would be like max right now. So they're talking about which populations would benefit from coming back first. They're talking about people who are having connection issues. Like obviously if you can't get on the internet, you can't participate in Zoom, you can't watch videos, you're really limited in what you're doing with your schooling. Maybe they'll bring back first special education students who need extra support for their learning. Maybe they're also thinking about like transition years, 9th graders, 5th graders, people who are coming to that, you know, that grade level for the first time, offering it to them. Now you can always still just stay at home, but like they'll offer the opportunity to do hybrid. So all that stuff they're trying to figure out through that survey. So if enough people don't do the survey, then it's not going to be accurate. And they're really worried that they're going to plan for a certain number of students coming to school and then have a different number of students coming. And that could be a problem for spacing and lunches. And I mean, just think about the cafeteria. How do you do social distancing in the cafeteria? I don't even know. I don't know. Let's see, there's some comments. How would it work if we went back to school? Like, how would the teachers do it? Like I said, I don't know. Right now I'm thinking I would still do the live Zoom calls. It's just that I would be teaching for the kids who are there, and the kids that are watching would just watch. I don't know.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm thinking it might go back to regular schedule, or it might be, it says till 3:55, or would it be to 2:45? They haven't decided. Eat outside. What's the question?
I was emailing my teacher yesterday. She said that she would be popping into her class for like college applications or something like that.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. The counselor, you mean?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's what I know about hybrid. They haven't really nailed it down because I think they're waiting to see just how many people are interested in doing that. What if only, 100 students want to come back? Then that's a whole different preparation than, 1,000. So the survey is important. So get to that. I think they're leaving it open for another, the rest of this week or till the middle of the week. I'll have to look at the cutoff date, but. All right, if anything else comes up about hybrid that you're wondering, email me. If I don't know, I will try to find out, but a lot of things are, almost every conversation I have with an administrator starts with, now, I'm not for sure, but every conversation starts like that. So, everybody, it's all tentative, I hate to say. But I just feel like nobody ever discusses these things with you guys, and I wanted to make sure that at least I could tell you what I know. Sadly, isn't much. Okay, item number 2, progress reports go in next Monday, just FYI. The STC Starfish is enacted. Starfish is their sort of like early warning system that they have at STC, and they're really relying on it, especially for dual classes in our distance learning environment. So it's sort of like a progress report. They all go, if you go over here, I put a link on the navigation over here to Starfish. It just takes you to a link in your JAGNet. But Starfish is an opportunity for an instructor to say, hey, there's an attendance problem. Hey, there's a grade problem. It gets raised with you. It should generate an email to you that there's a concern. Also to somebody at STC who's in charge of dual enrollment. And then also the people that are in charge of dual enrollment at our campus get notified. Also, it's an opportunity for us to go in and say, good job, keep up the good work, you're doing great. It's sort of like that. They do it twice during the term. So I'm going to put those in on Monday, and it'll be based on attendance and also the grades that we have in the grade book at that point in time. But just so you know, all the classes at East, those are due on Monday. I think Starfish isn't technically due until, for the instructors, until October 3rd or something like that, but I'm just going to do them at the same time and be finished with it. Questions on Starfish? Everything's got to have a cute name nowadays. Starfish. Project Starfish. Just sounds like we're going on a spy mission. All right, I want to talk a little bit about formatives, because formatives are going really well for some people and not so well for other people. And it's going to start to impact your grades Friday, because I'm going to put in the formative grades for your progress report. Last week, Thursday, I started noticing that some people had really vague answers sometimes, or just sort of put, I don't know, it seemed like they were just putting whatever, and I really don't want that to happen. I'm not really giving quizzes. I could, but I'm not. And the way that I'm checking to see how you're doing with your reading and how you're understanding the literature is through formatives. So I put this example up for Thursday and Friday in the formative itself so that you would see it. But it occurred to me that maybe I should outline, not just orally, but also on paper, what it is I'm looking for in those formatives. So they're worth 5 points. You can think of a 5 as 100, right? And some people, I think, are not convincing me that they're doing their reading assignment. It is never going to happen in this class that you come in and I explain the reading assignment to you. That is not what happens in here. So if, like, some people come to class and they think, oh, well, I sort of skimmed it or I started reading it, but she's going to explain it all, so I'll just listen. I don't do that. I'm assuming that you read and understood to a certain level, and then I ask you formative questions and we deal with those texts, assuming that you've already read them. It doesn't mean that I won't answer questions or talk about what we're reading, but I'm already assuming that you've read it and understood it to a pretty satisfactory level. And so I'm not going to go through the plot. I'm not going to go through the characters. I'm not going to explain what happened. I'm not going to give you a summary of what you read. So the way I'm checking to see are you reading is in the formative. So if your formative is 2 sentences long and it doesn't really say anything to answer the question, it's going to be a 1. And that is not a good grade. So I have been trying to communicate with people on the formatives. And if you go to the formative site, mine looks different than yours does, but you can see that there's a bell up here. And there will be a little red number, notification number there. And I put comments on almost all of the formatives. So I'm communicating with you about your reading and also about the formatives themselves. So if you haven't looked at those, you might want to, so that you can get some feedback. I'm trying to help the people who are not being super successful with the formatives to do better and to improve them. It's my main way of seeing how you're doing with your reading. So I'm looking for these things. I'm looking for you using your literary terminology. If you're talking about the protagonist, say the protagonist. If you're talking about a metaphor, use the term metaphor. I'm looking to see that you've read and thought about the assigned readings. Is it possible to just go on there and BS some stuff and try to convince me that you read it? Maybe. I don't know. If you want to take that chance, if you're feeling all gambly and risky, then go for it. But I've been teaching these things for a long time. And so the most vague answers are I'm gonna say something like, I'm not convinced that you even read this story, or that's not even accurate to the text. I'm reading them. So make sure that your response is worthy of your time and my time. I'm looking to see your mind at work. I'm trying to engage you in a conversation about literature, which is what happens in this class. So this is an opportunity for you to improve and get better scores on your formatives. I'm looking for you to communicate a complicated idea. And so the formatives, they should be taking you, if you've read, I would think they would take you 10 or 15 minutes to do. If you haven't read, it might be a lot longer than that, because you might have to go and read it before you can answer the question. Or a lot of times I'll ask you about the two pieces together and to play one off of the other, so that you have to be thinking in a different way about what you're reading. So that's a complicated thing to do. And I know that. That's why I am, rewarding them with points. And it's showing up in the grade book for the time that it's taking you to do them. So I'm looking for depth. I'm also looking a little bit, although I'm not really taking points off, grammar and vocabulary are important. If you're not capitalizing, the personal pronoun I don't know why not. It's not a text message, it's a class assignment. So, take a little eye toward that. If you have one word that's misspelled or there's a typo or something happens, that's forgivable. It's more of a casual conversation, but there's some people who don't even finish sentences or, whatever. So look to those things. And let's see if we can shore that up. Some of you are doing great, and you know that because you've been getting 5s and 4s. But if you've been getting 1s and 2s and 3s, that's not going to be a good grade in the grade book when I drop that formative grade. So I want to help you improve that. I did put an example on here. So if you want to see what's getting a 5, this is a good example of a 5. The day that I put that on there, this was the topic that day. Do they have to be that long? Not necessarily, but they need to have depth. They need to demonstrate that you've been thinking about what I'm asking you to read. So there's an example of one that got a 5 there. I'm not going to read it to you, you can read. So I don't know, I'm hoping that with the formatives we can improve over time. Use the comments that I'm giving you constructively, and hopefully that will improve your score. If you're struggling with formatives and those things still don't help you, then maybe we need to meet up and we can talk about, what might benefit you and how we could help you improve those things. I'm here to help you with that. All right. Item number 4 is for seniors. The counselors are going to come in this week. That's almost everybody in this class, actually. The counselors are going to come in this week and on Thursday. Apply Texas is the application that you fill out for most of the public schools and a couple of the private schools in Texas. And some of you might have already started your Apply Texas, some of you might not, but the counselors are going to come to normally it would be an asynchronous day, but we're going to have a class session at the normal time. You can sign on to this Zoom and the counselors will be here. They're going to talk to you about Apply Texas, and then they have me set up breakout rooms so that the counselors can work with you on your Apply Texas. Maybe you just need to get started on it. Maybe you started on it, but it kind of like fizzled out and you haven't worked on it anymore, or maybe you have a question. So the counselors are going to be here to help you with that on Thursday at our normal class time. Does that make sense? Seniors only. Juniors don't have to come. Juniors, work on your assignments. Worry about that stuff next year. Also, I know that the essays that you might have to do along with your college admissions are important. So I'm working on a project so that I can use my experience helping students get into their dream schools with their college admissions essay. I'm working on a project that you can use so we don't have to take up class time with that, and that will help you. And of course, I'll read through drafts and help you with them if you like. But that's coming too, probably toward the end of the week. I'll have something so that you can really go full steam ahead with your Apply Texas. Any questions about Apply Texas or Thursday? Oh, chat. What about scholarships? Okay, yeah. So scholarships, there are a few that are going on right now. I know some people are finishing up gates. There are a few that happen in the fall, but most of the fall is taken up with making sure that your applications are done, that you've done any retesting on ACT or SAT that you might need to do. And then the spring is usually when the bulk of the scholarships come up. Although you should know that the application that you do for Apply Texas at a lot of schools is also an application for the scholarships that the universities give out. So when you do, for example, your A&M application on Apply Texas, you're applying to the college, the university, but you're also applying for scholarships. If you do it by a certain date, it's usually the cutoff date is in December. So that means that not only is the admissions office getting your packet with your transcript and your essays and your application, but also the people who might offer you scholarships are getting that same packet. So that's why the essay is super important for both purposes. So they might say, oh, this person has great academics, you know, their essay really gives us insight into their character. We really want to have this person on our campus. And so they will offer you, when you get your letter that accepts you, or your email that accepts you into the university, it might say, we'd also like to offer you the Regent Scholarship in the amount of $10,000 a year. So it kind of happens at the same time if it's an institution scholarship. The separate scholarships, like the community scholarships, things like that, happen mainly in the spring. Gates is finishing up right now. I don't know if anybody is doing Gates. I've had a few questions already about Pell Grants because of Gates. So if you have questions about that stuff, send me a line and I'll help you. Oh, there's a couple more. Good chats. I know there's some for Hispanics, like, yeah, yeah, you just need to look them up and check the deadlines. Some of them don't even have them on until like January or February. They don't even have them available. Others, they're available. There's a few in the fall. You don't have to ask me to use the restroom. TMI on that. Just make sure you're muted. Nobody wants to hear that. All right, any other questions about college applications? I want to balance it because the juniors are kind of like, eh. But it's good for them to hear it too because they'll be experiencing it next year. We're trying the best we can to get those things to you and help you through that process like we normally would if we were on campus. So I don't know how it's going to go on Thursday. I'm going to try my best to organize it, but you know, like everything these days, we're trying our best. Let me get a shirt that just says trying my best, or tattoo. All right, anything else? You can put it in the chat before we move on to our material for today. Or you can unmute and actually speak to me. That'd be nice. Be nice to hear voices sometimes, besides the ones in my mind when I'm trying to go to sleep. Okay, my counselor told me I was eligible for the Gates scholarship, but it doesn't let me finish the application. So the thing with Gates is that you have to do a Pell Grant predictor first, because the Gates scholarships are all based on financial need. So what they'll have you do is they will have you go to a website where you do like a FAFSA predictor. And based on your parents' income, they will try to determine if you're going to qualify for Gates, because a lot of people were going and applying for the Gates scholarship who didn't have financial need. It's not a scholarship that's based on merit. Well, I mean, it is, but it's first based on financial need. So if your parents, here's the rough guideline for Pell Grant. Pell Grant is when the federal government will give you pretty much all of your tuition. And if you're not eligible for Pell Grant, then you're not going to be eligible for Gates. So there's no point in doing it. It's a long application. There's like 5 essays and, you know, there's a lot to fill out. So I'll just tell you for background, Pell Grant is usually if your parents together make less than $30,000 a year, you will probably get all of your education paid for by the Pell Grant. That's $30,000 combined. If your parents make between $30,000 and $60,000 combined in a year, this is just roughly, right? So you can get a feel for it. you might get some Pell Grant money. And so you might be eligible for Gates. If your parents together make more than $60,000 a year, you will not be Pell Grant eligible. You shouldn't even apply to Gates because you'll just be wasting your time. They're not even going to look at your application. So I know that sounds rough, but that's how it works. If they're giving out the money, they're deciding who they want to give it to. So maybe on that last note, put that on there, Alex. Maybe you have to go and do that predictor before you continue on. If you want to stay on after the meeting ends, and you can tell me specifically what you're running into. If I can help you, I will. If not, I can, get some help. If my parents aren't together, my dad probably won't help. How would that work? It's not, oh, well, I can respond to you separately. Or I'll just say in general. So if your parents aren't together, it's still about their income tax. So they have to go to the income tax that they filled out last year. It's about the income of both parents. So together, you have to add that up. I mean, you can still go and do the predictor. The predictor is going to ask you to put in your parents' salary information and all that stuff, and then it will pop out at the end and say, it's predicted that you will get a Pell Grant, or it's predicted that you won't get a Pell Grant. Yeah. A lot of people end up in the middle, right? Like my parents make together $62,000 a year, which isn't a huge amount, but it's not enough to get the Pell Grant. There are other ways to fund your education. I mean, like there's other scholarships that aren't based on financial need. They're based only on your merit. So that's where your rank comes into play, or your sports that you're in, or whatever, like all your other academics. So I don't want you to think that just because you don't qualify for Pell Grant or Gates that you're not going to get scholarships, because you will. Universities will want you. So if you're attractive to them, then they will try to give you money to get you to go there. That's the goal. That's why your application has to be good. That's why your essay has to be good. So no stress. Don't worry. I'm here to help you. We'll get through it. All right. Let me start with today's lesson so that we don't run out of time here. Obviously, you need to go and do today's formative. I asked you to orient yourself to critical lenses a little bit last time, and there was a video that you could watch, and there's also a PowerPoint that I made for you. So I just kind of want to ask if there are any questions about the concept of critical lenses that you looked through. Let me answer questions first, and then I'll give you kind of like a general sum up, and then we'll move on if there aren't any questions. Waiting for the chat, waiting for the... Okay, so as long as you know and have figured out that critical lenses are like different viewpoints, different ways that we can look at a piece of literature, then I think you're in good shape. It doesn't mean that we have to adapt that method of looking at a piece of literature, but we need to kind of put on a perspective in order to look at a piece of literature. Maybe it's gender-based, maybe it's economic-based. Those things are ways that we can look at pieces of literature. So when we say critical lenses or critical theory, that's what we mean. In the essay that you're going to write, I'm going to ask you to choose a critical theory. You're studying 3 this week, and apply it to a new piece of literature that you read, new piece of short fiction. So it's important to get an idea for the different types of critical lenses. There are, I don't know, 10 or 12 different main ones. We're only going to study a few, but the critical lenses are designed to help you look at a different perspective of what you are reading in literature, especially historically, right? Like we could look at a piece of literature like, remember we read Battle Royal, and we had to say, okay, well, we need to have a certain perspective with that, because in 2020, the viewpoint of that kind of behavior is different than the viewpoint from 100 years ago. So historical lens is one of the ones that we use to look at a piece of literature. We have to understand the time period and kind of make allowances for that sort of thing. So are there any questions about critical lenses, what they are? Because that was last week's focus. Okay. So this week, you can kind of drop down here and see that this week for next Tuesday, there are 3 different critical lenses that I want you to study. There are 3 different PowerPoints to walk you through. So you should be able to take any piece of literature and say, well, it'd be interesting to look at it through this lens, or this lens doesn't really apply to that piece of literature. And then that way you can start practicing using the lenses to analyze literature. So there's 3 different ones to look at this week. Next week, I'll talk to you about those types and probably assign the essay for you to begin. All right. How did we do with point of view? You should have read this chapter on point of view for today. All right. Does it help you if I go through it a little bit, or have you got it already? You already have it? You don't need me to go through it? I can just, there's a couple things that they don't say in the book that I want you to add to your notes. And one of them is with first person narrators. So go where you have, yeah, I see the text. So, go where you have your notes on first person narrators. The first person narrator is the narrator who's in the story. So they're using the personal pronoun I as they're talking. That narrator is always going to be unreliable. Why would I say that a first person narrator is always unreliable? Ideas? They change the story to fit their needs. Yeah. So, or their perspective, right? So if I asked you to tell me about the date that you went on last weekend, you're going to tell me from your perspective. You can't help but tell me from your perspective because you might be telling me the truth, but it's from your viewpoint. But maybe if I was an observer, I might say, like, maybe I ask you about your date and you say, oh, it went awesome. He was so into me. Like, I think we're going to get married, right? But then the third person who was like just watching the situation from across the room might go, I don't think he likes her, right? Like I could tell that he was sort of backing away from her and not interested in what she was saying. And so the third person narrator can more objectively evaluate the situation. The first person narrator kind of puts their own personal lens on the situation. So a first person narrator, like the one we have in Araby, like the one we have in yellow wallpaper, they're too close to the action that they can't be objective. So they're inherently unreliable and biased, yeah. So keep that in mind. If you have a first person narrator, they might be telling it truthfully from their perspective, but their perspective is limited, right? If I'm reporting on a crime, I can only report what I saw, not everything that happened, because maybe I missed something or from another viewpoint, something else happened. So keep that in mind about first person narrators. They do talk about irony. Do you want me to go into irony a little bit, or is that something they've been talking about for a long time and you don't need me to do it? There are like 10 different types of irony, but they only ever talk about these 3 for some reason. The reason they talk about it here, yeah, I'll go over it. The reason that they talk about it here is because with the first person narrator, irony is a lot more obvious, because it's ironic that the person who's talking about how great the date is and she thinks she's going to get married to the guy that she's on a date with is ironic because the third person perspective didn't see that at all. So the irony can be heightened through a first person narrator. That's why they drop it in this section. Or dramatic irony. Dramatic irony is when you know something as a reader that a character doesn't know. So they use this a lot in suspense, right? That's how suspense is built in a piece. If I know that the character is really about to kill his girlfriend because he's got a knife, but she doesn't know it, then there is suspense on my part as the reader because she's clueless. Does that make sense? So first person narrator allows for a heightened sense of irony and therefore suspense. They give some examples. I don't think that the examples always work for you because a lot of times they're talking about stories that you haven't read. But I also don't think this is the first time that you've heard about irony. So you need to be able to identify it, analyze it, and talk about it as a tool that the writer's using to make a point, or like a plot device. something that creates conflict. Unreliable narrators, I talked about that already. Third person, there is such a thing as a second person narrator. They don't talk about it in this chapter, but there is a second person narrator. It's very rare. And it's sort of like the first person narrator is including you as the reader in the story. So they don't put that in here. Omniscient narrator knows everything about the character's mindset. The way that you'll know it's an omniscient narrator is when the thoughts of the character are presented in the story. And the, like the conflicts that they're having, the internal conflicts. There is such a thing as a limited omniscient narrator, which confuses people sometimes. So just because a narrator is omniscient doesn't mean that they know inside of all of the characters' minds. So sometimes what happens is a narrator is omniscient, but only for the protagonist. You can't see into the minds of any of the other characters, just the protagonist from the third person perspective. So we call that a limited omniscient narrator. Omni just means all, so all seeing, all knowing, but limited omniscient seems like an oxymoron, but the idea is that the narrator can only see into the operation of one character's mind. Hopefully I'm not going too fast. Objective narrator is what we call the narrator who can sort of logically evaluate the scene because they're not involved in it. They're the bystander who's not even mentioned in the story, the fly on the wall, the person who's observing and reporting back. The third person objective narrator is kind of like a reporter, just telling what happened. Talked about limited omniscient. Okay, another one that I want to bring up, make sure that you have notes on the child eye narrator. They call it here the first person child point of view. There is a term for that, and it's called the child's eye perspective. Have you read, a good example of that is To Kill a Mockingbird. Did y'all read that when you were sophomores? To Kill a Mockingbird? That's probably the best example, most prominent example of child's eye narrator, because your narrator in that story is an 8-year-old girl named Scout. And 8-year-olds don't know everything about the world. They might think that they do, but they don't. So when Scout's talking about the trial and what her dad's doing, she doesn't really understand it. And she also doesn't really understand racism. But she talks about things that are happening, and we as knowledgeable readers, we understand that what she's talking about is systemic racism in the South, but she doesn't visualize it that way because she's a little girl. So on purpose, Harper Lee is setting us up as readers to understand something through a child's eye, and there's a perspective there that's important. Let me see what else is in this section. Omniscient, we talked about that. Objective point of view. They're just giving you more examples there and why an author might choose one over the other. It seems like they're repeating again because they're talking about the same terms, but in this section, selecting an appropriate point of view, they're talking about why would an author choose first person over third person, omniscient over limited in that section. So it helps us with our analysis to think about that. Like Yellow Wallpaper, what if it was told from the husband's point of view? Totally different story, right? So the choice that an author makes is something that we can analyze. All right. Is there anything else from that chapter that I didn't really touch on that you want me to go over or spend a little more time talking about? Whenever I say that, if you don't want to bring it up in class, then you can always, like email me or touch base with me or stick around for a minute after class and I can talk with you about it. So if the answer is yes, but I don't want to put it in the chat, then just stick around for a minute after class or touch base with me later and we can talk about it. All right. The last thing I want to do for class today before we go over the assignments for next Tuesday is to talk a little bit about Araby and Yellow Wallpaper. I don't really have time. We have to finish at, we might have a little bit of time. Let's start with James Joyce. So there's a slideshow here, but I think I can just go through the basics. A lot of times people, when they read Araby for the first time, come away from that story kind of confused because they're kind of like, nothing happened in that story. A kid went to market and didn't buy anything. That's not a story. And so a lot of people get confused by that. But James Joyce's story Araby is one of the most famous pieces of short fiction in all of English. And this slideshow kind of walks you through it. I'm just going to touch on a few things because we took a little extra time up front. But the idea is that Araby is a piece that was ahead of its time, really. That's James Joyce right there. Before the 19th century, we didn't really have short fiction. There were stories, but they were usually handed down, you know, through generations and not really set up for the way that we think of short fiction today. They're usually historical, things about culture, etc. It wasn't until the 19th century that we really had short fiction at all. Before that, people wrote poetry and people wrote plays and songs and things like that, but not short fiction. So short fiction is fairly new as a genre. But James Joyce kind of changed the whole landscape with stories like Araby. Araby comes from a short story collection called Dubliners, because he was Irish. And it's about the people who live in Dublin. And so what happened was, before James Joyce came along, people wrote sort of fantasy-based short stories. You know, things that wouldn't really happen in real life, like Edgar Allan Poe. If you read his work, those things are probably not going to happen to you or to the average person. I mean, are you killing people and leaving their hearts beneath your floorboards in your house? Probably not. Can you identify with somebody who does? Probably not. So they were fantasy based. But James Joyce came along and he said, what if I wrote a story that's about the things that everybody goes through, the human experience, everyday reality? And everybody was like shocked by that. It was earth-shattering and weird, and everybody thought that it was strange. But he was able to make some social criticism and talk about our society in a way that short fiction had never done before. So James Joyce's Araby kind of marks that type of literature. And when we think about it, that little boy goes through an experience that makes him grow just a little bit, right? He goes from being a boy to kind of being a young man based on the experience, because he is trying to get a present for this girl, right? He likes this girl. She's older. How do we know that? How old is the kid? It doesn't say in the story, but what do you expect? Is he 25? No. He has to get money from his uncle and permission. What's your best guess? 8? I don't know about 8, because he's also attracted to Mangan's sister. So I'm thinking like there has to be a puberty situation going on, right? He watches her and he looks at her silhouette in her dress and like stuff like that. So I'm thinking he's at least 12, 13 years old, but probably not a lot older than that. So if he is looking at this girl, young woman, she's older because she's his friend's older sister. She's probably 18, 19 years old. And he looks at her and he likes her, right? Like he likes looking at her. He's got his little puberty stuff going on, looking at her. He watches her through the window. He waits until she leaves the house so he can leave the house and maybe run into her and say something, right? But in what world is it realistic that a 19-year-old girl is going to date a 13-year-old boy? Really? Are all those high school graduate girls running down to the middle school to find a boyfriend these days? It would be weird if you found out that somebody was doing that, right? So his chances are very slim. But it doesn't stop him from dreaming. He's got a quest, right? Remember chapter 1 from How to Read Literature Like a Professor? He's on a quest. He's got a mission. Yeah, I'm going to get this girl. The thing is, he's not really equipped. He doesn't have any money. He's got to get permission from his uncle. You know, he's a little kid, but he's going for it. And the ending kind of goes where we think it's going to go. He's unable to secure a present for her. She says, why don't you bring me something from Araby? I can't go. And he says, all right, well, I'll bring you something, right? Like, I'm a man, I'm going to conquer something and bring it back to you. But he's not really, not yet. And he grows to learn that he might have outstepped his bounds a little bit. Because by the time he gets to Araby, he doesn't have enough money and it's closing and nobody wants to take him seriously. So he's got this final thought where he says that he was driven and derided by his vanity. And he learns that he promised more than he could deliver. Well, that's something that we can all recognize, right? We all have people we want to impress. We all sort of overstep our bounds and promise things that we end up not being able to really do. It's the quest that the story is about. And that quest is not something that's for storybooks only. It's a quest that we all take on. So there's a revelation in this story that is universal. We all think that the dream could happen to us. We all think that we're Harry Potter living under the stairs and we're just waiting for our Hogwarts letter, right? I'm special, really, I'm special. You just need to recognize it. But unfortunately, life sometimes beats us back down and says, no, you're not. You're normal. Just be normal, accept it. And that's what happens to this boy. And that embarrasses us. Sometimes we get embarrassed by our foolishness. So James Joyce was really kind of saying, hey, you know what? Let me write a story that's all about what everybody goes through. And that was new. It's not so new now, but it was new back then. Yeah. All right. So anything about Araby that you want to talk about? That's just kind of an overview of why Araby has more to it than we originally, the first time we read it, we're kind of like, but hopefully that information can give you a little more to think about with that story. The last thing I want to do before we go is talk a little bit about yellow wallpaper, because that's another one that is a little bit confusing sometimes. Luckily, with that story, Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote, about a year after she published the story, she wrote an article because people were bugging her about that story. It's creepy, it's got a weird ending, the person goes nutsy cuckoo, and the husband's kind of the reason. And so she had to come out at the end with an explanation for why she wrote it. So I want you to take about 5 minutes and read through, you can click right here, number 5. And I want for you to read her explanation. We don't always have explanations from authors about why they wrote what they wrote. So take about 5 minutes and read this to yourself. I'm going to ask you what insights this gave you to the story in a minute. Okay, so what are some insights that this article gave you about the story that you didn't have when you were reading it, do you think? That it was intended to help people go crazy? No, she says the exact opposite, right? She says it was not intended to drive people crazy, but to save people, right? Yeah, that it was based on a true story. That's good, Christina, because she went through.
Right? So the idea is that she was also put into what they call the rest cure. It's right here in this paragraph. So this is a time period before psychology. This is before there was even a study of psychology. I have to change to my other earbud. So what would depression look like to somebody 150 years ago if there was no such thing as the study of psychology? It would probably just look,
or discontent or whatever. So the fact that she might have depression, in this case, it's probably postpartum depression, which is depression that women get after they give birth because of their hormone situation in their bodies. She's a baby, right? If that's something that we understand now, but they didn't know about back in the time, then they had a weird way of trying to solve it. So if a woman gets all weird and kind of emotional and depressed after she has a baby, their solution was what's called the rest cure, which meant, you can look it up, which meant no stimulation of your mind. You're not allowed to read, you're not allowed to write, you're not allowed to do anything for 6 months. You just lay in a bed, like a reset, right? We're just gonna reset this lady. We don't know what's up with her, so we're just gonna put her in a room and give her the rest cure. She just needs to rest. Well, what if somebody did that to you? You can be in this room, but you can't be on your phone. You can't read a book. You can't watch TV. You're just gonna lay there. 6 months. Yeah, we'd go crazy. It's sort of like lockdown with all of the perks. And so that's the point that she's making. She's saying in the story, look at what happens with this rest cure if you go through it to the letter. In this article, she says, luckily, I didn't do it for very long. I realized that it was making me worse, so I stopped. But she imagined in her mind, what would happen if I didn't? And this is the story that we get as a result. And so she's explaining that because she wants to make a social statement about this kind of cure, right? This way that women are handled, this way that women's symptoms aren't taken seriously. Oh, don't worry your head, just go to bed for a little while and you'll be okay, right? Like they're not legitimate concerns like mental wellness. We know differently now, of course. And so the lens we have to put on is a historical one. We have to say, okay, well, 100 and some years ago, this is how these things were taken care of. Nowadays, we would go to therapy, right? Maybe even pharmaceuticals would help us. So the point of this article is that there are things that are revealed about why she wrote it that help us understand the story and her purpose. We don't always get that from authors. I mean, Shakespeare doesn't sit around explaining why he wrote Hamlet, right? Entertainment. All right, is there anything else about yellow wallpaper that you want to talk about? You can put it in the chat or you can unmute. It's a super famous story also. I have a lot of students who, when they go off to college, they're in a psychology class and their professor will ask them if they studied this story. It's sort of famous in a lot of circles. All right, let me wrap up for today then. Just some reminders. Today, do your formative. Thursday, there's another formative, and seniors, you've got that counseling meeting. Before next class period, take a look at the 3 different critical lenses that I've outlined here for you. There's also information in your book too. Maybe I'll put some page numbers in case it helps you, but for the most part, I think the PowerPoint should be good. And then read the chapter on theme. We're getting ready to wrap up our study of short fiction pretty soon. So read theme and make any notes that you need to from that text. Obviously, we'll talk about it next Tuesday. And there's 2 stories to read for next week. One is This Is What It Means to Say Phoenix, Arizona by Sherman Alexie, who is a Native American writer, and The Nightingale and the Rose by Oscar Wilde, who was a British writer. So any questions about what to do this week? Is it helpful for me to put those reminders in the classroom? Is that working out, or is that just extra? It's good.
No, it's helping better.
Yeah, if they're bugging you, just go and put done and ignore them. But I think for some people, like, it helps them organize. So I've been putting them in there, like reminding for the formative. I feel like most people go in and they look to see what they have to do that day. And so it will say today, this, that, and the other. So I've been putting them in there. All right.
It helps.
Okay, good. I'm glad. Is there anything else that I can do to or answer for you before we finish for today? I know I was talking a lot today. I'll try to mix it up more next time. All right, then if you don't have any questions, you can go. Seniors, remember that I'll see you on Thursday, same time, same station. And other than that, you can take off. I hope you have a good week. Bye, everybody. Hi, Alex. Did you want to talk about your application?